Welcome to the Thing About the Salem Witch Trials. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Welcome back, Dan Gagnon. Tell us a little bit about your work and what brought you to Salem history.
Hello all, well my name is Dan Gagnon. I live in Danvers, Massachusetts. They used to be known as Salem Village during the time of the witch hunt. My book was A Salem Witch, a biography of Rebecca Nurse, one of the victims of the 1692 witch hunt. And recently, in the past year or two, I've been invited to give some talks on some events of the 250th anniversaries of events during the American Revolution locally here on the North Shore. And so today, those two interests kind of intersect.
It's so exciting to learn more about the role of Essex County in Massachusetts in the Revolution and some of those key figures. So why is it significant that the area known for one of America's darker chapters contributed to the creation of an independent nation?
Well, I think one thing about these two sort of historical topics, the creating the independent nation of the United States and the witch trials, is that they seem very far removed from one another. With the way people learn history in many high schools in America, they really start with the American Revolution, and therefore the witch trials seem so distant behind it because it's like not even covered, so it must have been a long time ago. In reality, it's only about a generation later in some cases. In others, we have participants in the witch trials, you have grandchildren. It'd be like 2 generations later. But some of these are just their sons, their daughters, still alive at the time of the revolution and play important roles. With the witch hunt, we see a real movement as it ends at the end of 1692 to try to give people accused of crimes, prisoners, more rights. We have the witch hunt ends because of public pressure. It's not, really democracy, but if public pressure, the Puritans all throughout the 1600s were really concerned about their rights. They really valued their self-government. And so it really isn't much of a surprise that it was Massachusetts that were really some of the most vocal advocates for these rights when the king in the 1760s and 1770s starts to infringe on them.
What is that first sense of something's happening for Danvers and Salem in that area?
So people in the Danvers and Salem area would have heard about many acts passed by Parliament that were really taking away their rights. Many of these people involved in the Revolution, at least those who were slightly older, not the very youngest, had fought in the French and Indian War. They had fought for the king. They had fought for the British Empire. But when they get back home, they think they're being mistreated by this government they just spent years and years fighting for. In Salem and Danvers, it really starts to heat up in 1774. What happens is in December of 1773, there's the Boston Tea Party. And after that, once it takes a couple months for word to reach Britain about it, the royal government is absolutely enraged and furious at this destruction of property, this attack on the East India Company, who were really well tied in with the royal family, of course. And what happens is we have a series of coercive acts specifically against Massachusetts that will really alienate more and more people who had not already been alienated by taxes. And in particular, they close the port of Boston. They change the Massachusetts charter, just like they did in 1691, but nobody heard about it till 1692 in Massachusetts by the time it showed up. So we have a parallel there. And the capital of Massachusetts is moved to Salem. The legislature, the general court, meets in the townhouse in downtown Salem, which is not the same building the witch trials took place in. It's the sequel of the building, but it's like right next door. It's the same spot, right on Washington Street in downtown Salem. And what we have here is British soldiers camped on the Common in Salem. General Gage is made governor. Is really like a military governor of Massachusetts. He lives in Danvers that summer, bringing soldiers there. And when he's in Danvers, he's right down the road from the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. That you have these British soldiers camped out like almost across the street. It's that close where the soldiers set up their encampment. And that summer, you're going to have real local issues that basically all of these things people have been reading about are now in their backyard. we have the legislature meets in Salem that summer, and they want to choose delegates for a Continental Congress. Well, the world governor doesn't like this, I mean, of course, and he's going to try to stop this. And what ends up happening is General Gage had sent British troops to downtown Salem the day that the legislature is meeting. This is June 17th of 74, exactly a year before the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so they're in the townhouse and they're meeting, and they decide to lock all the doors and kick the public out. And somebody there goes to General Gage and says, they're up to something. Why did they kick everybody out and lock all the doors? So that's when he sends soldiers. He sends the secretary of the province, like the secretary of state, basically, but it's not a state. And he has a proclamation dissolving the legislature, but they can't get in. And so the secretary of state reads it on the street outside. The House of Representatives inside, they never heard it, so they can keep going about their business. They can claim they didn't know that they had been shut down, and they pick people for the Continental Congress in downtown Salem, are 4 representatives from Massachusetts. And that really sets off a couple other events that summer of people trying to defy General Gage. Salem hosts a town meeting, which seems totally normal. It's your local government that had been around since the 1600s. All the voters gather. But General Gage had effectively banned town meeting, local government, other than your once a year set your town budget meeting, because they were using these meetings to spread ideas that he didn't like. He arrests the Salem Committee of Correspondence. Their soldiers are in downtown Salem, and then 3,000 protesters, I guess is the word, show up. And Gage backs down and releases the people he had arrested. And so a week later, the end of our local pressure, a few days later, Danvers had watched this in the town next door, and they decide we should have our own town meeting, see if General Gage shows up. And so they do, and they meet. They don't really have a lot to really say. It's really just like a dare. And then they just extend it, and they're hanging out for like a few hours, just waiting to see what the reaction will be. And someone does tell General Gage, but he decides he doesn't have enough soldiers. He yells out at the messenger, "Damn them, I won't do anything about it unless His Majesty sends me more troops." And the next day he returns to Boston because he was afraid similar things would start happening in Boston.
That's so fascinating about that happening right there in Salem and Danvers in 1774. It's one of those chapters that high school where you learn about the Boston Tea Party and the massacre and all those big events, but what's happening in Danvers and Salem is so important. And you also have in February 1775, something big goes down in Salem with Leslie's retreat.
Locally, it's sort of our next step is Colonel Leslie and his soldiers had actually been some of those camped in Danvers and the Salem Common that summer, but they went back to Boston with Gage in the end of the summer. And so a few months go by, and Gage and the royal government start doing powder raids, which where they realize these local militias had a bunch of guns and they had a bunch of gunpowder, and this was making General Gage uneasy. So in several towns, he would send out soldiers to try to seize them. The last time he tries that is Lexington and Concord. But he had done this up in what's now Somerville. With the Salem, the gunpowder raid, in particular, there were a couple cannons there, small like field pieces. He sends Colonel Leslie by boat to Marblehead, gets off, marches into downtown Salem, getting back to the local Puritan heritage that was still there in the 1770s. General Gage picks Sunday morning because they're all in the meeting house and church, and they can't raise the militia easily. That was a intentional, pretty effective tactic because the British soldiers get all the way through Marblehead, all the way into downtown Salem before anybody notices. So it is a surprise in that sense, pretty much, at least effectively a surprise. And they want to cross the bridge to North Salem, which would be like as if you were heading into Danvers out of downtown Salem. And they raise the bridge. And they just don't let the British soldiers cross. They get into a somewhat comical technical argument that Colonel Leslie says this is the King's Highway. You can't stop a British soldier. The local people say, actually, it's a private bridge. It's a toll bridge that we built with our own money. So yes, we can deny you access and things you didn't think anybody would actually care about or be involved in a serious confrontation. And what happens is that just buys time so that men from Marblehead, Salem, Danvers, and Beverly can turn out with their guns, and they come to a negotiated settlement where they let Leslie cross the bridge, walks about 100 paces, looks around, doesn't see any cannons, goes home. And he can tell the governor, I looked, didn't see him. And they avoid actual fighting. There's one person who gets stabbed because General Gage has his soldiers try to seize the boats to cross the river as people in the boats are breaking them up with hatchets so they can't be used. And somebody does get stabbed. They don't die. So it's not that there's zero bloodshed, but effectively.
How did the men from Danvers and Salem areas, how did they respond to the Lexington Alarm?
That is an excellent question. And really one of the core ways that they are involved in the American Revolution is day one. We have the Danvers militia has many companies. On the day of Lexington and Concord, there's going to be more than 300 men under arms who answer the call. And what happens is, to take us back to the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, we have Rebecca Nurse's great-grandson, Francis Nurse, is a sergeant in one of the companies. His captain is John Putnam. There's another sergeant who's a Tarbell, which would be one of his cousins, another name from the witch trials. And at about 9 a.m. on April 19th, 1775, they would have heard the bells of the Danvers Meeting House tolling, which would have been not typical. And they all gather on the village training field from the north part of Danvers, what's now the town of Danvers. They gather up. They march south to what's today the city of Peabody. That was the southern half of Danvers. They meet up right near Peabody Square. The tree is still there where they all gathered up underneath the different companies before they set off to intercept the British. That tree does exist. It's a giant old tree on the corner. And what they do is they are going to hurry. They run a lot of it, 16 miles to cut off the British. And at this point, they've heard the British have marched on Lexington. They know there are some patriot leaders there, sure, but it really is another move to seize arms and powder, just like they tried at Salem. And what lesson had been learned by the British that is kind of what leads to the actual war breaking out that day was they felt like they lost Leslie's retreat in Salem, that they were overpowered by the militia, that, they look kind of foolish. They were sent packing back to Boston. And when they do this again, there is this determination of that's not going to happen again, which will lead to it being a much more confrontational situation. So when they open fire in Lexington and then Concord, the word spreads really quickly throughout Massachusetts with the Danvers men and a couple from Beverly that they just live closer to downtown Danvers. They know they can't make it to Lexington in time. It's too far. But they try to cut them off on their way back to Boston. So they meet up at the Jason Russell House in Menotomy, which is today the town of Arlington. Jason Russell is actually the ancestor of Kurt Russell, the famous actor. He had a big visit to this historic site sometime around the 250th last year of Patriots Day. And with this event mostly at Russell's house, but that little downtown neighborhood is really, really brutal. Danvers loses the most men on that day, second only to Lexington. The fighting is savage, it's brutal, and the reason for that is when the British are retreating from Lexington, they are constantly being shot at behind all these trees, all these rock walls, what you think of in those paintings, what you learn about in school about it. And the British, by the time they get to Arlington, a column of reinforcements has met up with them. So they're stronger. They have twice as many soldiers. And they are really, really, really PO'd at how their morning has gone. They are enraged at what has happened to them. And they take it out on Menotomy. The Danvers militia, the local militia, there's other towns that made it there too, take up positions waiting for the British to approach them. Basically like standing their ground as the British are marching on them, not hiding behind a bunch of wall of them and running away. So it really is a confrontation. And what happens is the British will kill pretty much anybody. If a gunshot comes out of a house, they'll kill everybody in that house. At the Russell house in particular, Russell was 58. Jason Russell, he could like barely walk, but he was not very well, but he said he was going to stay. The entire British column had to march right past his front door. So people were telling him not to stay because that was a bad setup. What happens is the Danvers men dug in at his house, and in total, 11 Americans are killed in his house. They're fighting outside. They're fighting in the doorway. He's killed in his doorway, Russell. They are fighting in the living room, the cellar, the attic, just room by room with bayonets, with swords. And to show you how enraged the British were, Russell's body is destroyed. Every soldier that passed his doorway stabbed him on their way by just because they were mad. And it really is a very savage day. There's people who are just in downtown Menotomy. There's a story of people not involved in any sort of fighting that were just captured by the British and robbed. The British execute prisoners of war. They plunder, they steal, they loot the houses on their way by. There's a story of two guys who were just at a bar, the Cooper Tavern in Menotomy, and they decided not to leave, which probably should have. And they end up mangled by the British soldiers. They're just sitting there having a beer. They weren't involved in the battle. They didn't have anything to do with the Danvers militiamen. In total, I should say, there's about 49 Massachusetts people who are killed and 68 British soldiers at Menotomy. And we see people from Danvers, again, all of these people with seemingly ties to the witch hunt. Danvers is one of the few towns that brings back their people who were killed, and they weren't just buried there. Then we have, again, Putnams. We have cousins of the Nurse family who fight and die at this event right before the British do make it back to Boston.